Hello to everyone, and we are continuing with this series of lessons on Asian theological resources on conflict and reconciliation. And we're continuing today to speak about the way of doing theology dialogically, how to do theology in dialogues. Last time we were really much on the theoretical ground, trying to determine what were the methods of doing so, what were the styles of dialogue. What I want to show today is that actually, naturally, in the Asian context, often theology has been done dialogically. And I would like to do so by speaking about the historical examples, which is the one of Jesuits and Chinese literati from the end of the 16th century to the end of the 18th century, as a kind of model, at least historical model, a matrix through which Asian theology started to be done dialogically. What is important is that Jesuits had to read the Chinese classics, while Chinese literati slowly became acquainted through translation with Western classics, not only the Bible, but scientific treatises, translation of Aristotle slowly, and so on and so on. So reading the others' classic, the Western classic for the Chinese, or the Chinese classics for the Jesuits, and after that Westerners, was an endeavor loaded with challenges that required each side to progressively elaborate new principles of reading. And also you were observing how the other was reading your own classics, his reactions to your classics. So that was part of the interactive process through which both sides were trying to understand the episteme, which means the word of knowledge, the principle of knowledge of their counterparts. So of course, everyone was starting from a given, from his own educational and religious background. The Jesuit educational cursus itself was drawn as a mapping of the classics. It was encyclopedic. You were reading the Aristotelian and scholastic corpus, of which we spoke last time. You were reading the classics of modern science and theology. And you were also reading the biblical studies in a more direct way than before, because you were more acquainted with Hebrew and Greek than was the case in past centuries. And actually, you were slowly starting to read the Bible in a different way. And Jesuits in China contributed to the change of focus on the Bible, because when Chinese chronologies were known, well, biblical chronologies didn't look so literal as was the fact before. Though the ability of Matteo Ricci to work in cooperation with Chinese literati contributed from the beginning to make the presentation of the new faith in China, as well as of the Chinese worldview in the West, what I would call an exercise in comparative reading. I would say a dialogue through the prism of reading the others' classic. We know that Jesuits were trying first to evangelize China through indirect means, introducing Western science and technology, which was a kind of confirmation of the truth of Christianity, which he has brought with him the Treaty of the Sphere of the World and other book of astronomy that Clavius, Jesuit scientist, sent him quite soon. So actually, Chinese literati had to understand first the principle of Western science as a way to enter into the principle of knowledge including of theological knowledge of their counterpart. So this encounter was creative. It had to be creative. And this is why the apological treatise written by Ritchie as a kind of apex of culmination of this enterprise, which we translate as the true meaning of the Lord of Heaven, is actually a masterpiece till now, something that has no equivalent, because it refers very precisely to Confucian vocabularies and worldview, while it remains structured by an argumentation which is very scholastic in its logic. We know actually that Ritchie was trying to do the same thing for the West, introducing China, but his Latin translation of Chinese classics have been lost. Or more exactly, they have been introduced into Jesuit translations that were published more than 100 years later. Actually, this endeavor on all sides was not an easy one. It was a controversial one. We spoke of dialogue last time. Well, let's say that dialogue or entering into dialogue triggers debates within your own faith community. Actually, there were resistances to Ritchie's approach within the Society of Jesus at a very early stage. After the death of Ritchie, his successor acted upon complaints raised by other Jesuits. They said that the Chinese lexicon adopted by Jesuits was not congruent with Christian dogma, that it was theist or sometimes atheist, that actually it was too much influenced by Buddhism and so on. So we have a lot of internal documents of the Society of Jesus which show that this idea of a dialogue and progression through an integration of the reading of the other classics was not so fully accepted. At the same time, actually, philosophical and theological development in Europe were very much influenced by this discovery of China made by the Jesuits. There is especially the work of Leibniz, which was a huge theological and philosophical development, especially his discourse on the natural theology of the Chinese, that is based on those internal Jesuit memoirs, Jesuits documents, and while he reads documents that are hostile to Ritchie, actually Leibniz concurs very much with Ritchie and says that there is in the Chinese classics what he calls a natural theology, which Leibniz says is much closer to Christianity than the one that expounds Descartes, for instance. Though for Leibniz, there is no doubt that Chinese classics were actually expressing what he was calling a natural experience of God, a natural theology. Well, we know that after those debates within the Society of Jesus, actually, there were other controversies that were on rituals, but those controversies on rituals, the quite controversy, would actually be based on different understanding of Chinese notions and spirituality. It doesn't mean actually that today everyone agrees with the view of Ritchie and his successor. For instance, John Lagerwey, a sinologist, says that the distinction drawn by Ritchie and his successor were encoded into Western concepts that were both distorting the Chinese popular experience of spirituality and helping the literati to assert their power over the people. He says, for instance, that the distinction between the civil and the religion, there will be civil rights and religious rights, didn't make sense for Chinese people, but that it helped somehow Chinese literati to exercise a police, a control on popular rituals. Lagerwey writes, the Chinese elite was in many ways a willing participant in the Jesuit misinterpretation. The Neo-Confucian elite had its own project, namely to transform Chinese society by ridding it of the rituals of shaman, Buddhist, and Taoist, and putting Confucian rituals in their place. So we see that when a dialogue starts, actually it doesn't trigger changes only for yourself and your interlocutor, but for the communities of believers on both sides. So dialogue indeed may always trigger debates and conflict. Dialogue is never an innocent endeavor. It has consequences. As I said last time, it does change the world, reality. Anyway, at the same time, dialogue is a force for change. The knowledge of Chinese source and of the classical text was progressing in the same time as the introduction in China of the Aristotelian scholastic and biblical classics was progressing as well. Now, the first Latin translation, and it is a good and very interesting translation, whatever its defect, of 3 of the 4 books of China, was published in Paris in 1687. That's an important time in history. And it was a consequence of translation undertaken for around 100 years. And the way Confucius was approached was actually extremely laudatory. We can say that the ethical system of the philosopher Confucius is sublime. It is at the same time simple, sensible, and derived from the best sources of natural reasons. The same thing that Leibniz says. Never has human reason, without the support of divine revelation, reached such a level and such a force. This is what the Jesuit Couplet writes in the introduction, and it shows how much he has been impressed by his dialogue with Confucian classics. Now, I would say that was the first stage of dialogue. The mutual introduction of Chinese classics to Westerners and of Western classics to the Chinese. Now, once this introduction was made, there was a second stage, still in the same period, end of the 16th century to end of the 18th century, which I would call the passage from classics to meta-language. I'm going to explain this concept. Well, important date again, 1687, 5 French Jesuits arrived in China, and they are called mathematicians of the king. It's first the king Louis XIV, but very quickly they will become also the mathematicians of the emperor. They teach Kongxi in mathematics, and they are good at medicines too. After them, 40 other French Jesuits will settle in China. So during the 16th century, you will have mainly Italian and some Portuguese Jesuits. You will have French Jesuits in majority and some Portuguese Jesuits still, mainly during the 18th century. But I would say in the second third of the 18th century, the most numerous nation among Jesuits in China would be Chinese themselves, which means that after 1730, Chinese Jesuits are not predominant, but most important component of the Jesuit mission, which triggers, I would say, another dialogue within the Chinese Jesuit mission itself. So what those French Jesuits were going to give to Europe were what they call evidences from China, that Europe was a product of history and not of nature, that advanced civilization could take shape and evolve on basis other than those of European civilization. Confucianism was providing a civil religion based on reason, guarantor of social order, while it was not bound to the dogma of Christian religion. So it means that Europe felt challenged when it came to the consistency of its sphere of knowledge and their background. Before that, knowledge and faith were considered as being unbreakable, as being one and the same. And suddenly human knowledge can be separated from any affirmation of the faith. But within those French Jesuits, another current will evolve from this initial remark, which is that actually Chinese classics and civilization could be read as a kind of second revelation of another way of speaking of God. They were fascinating by both the language, the character, the structure of the language, and the wisdom resources that this language was expressing, and was saying as a kind of code. Of course, this is facilitated by Chinese characters that you can see as a kind of code of realities, a code that was transcribing the beliefs and knowledge of humankind, and especially what was the natural faith, the natural theology of humankind before the flood, before Noah, before the flood had been invading the whole of humankind. And actually they were working from the I Ching as seen as the most extraordinary expression of the Chinese meta-language, code of all reality, and arithmetic. The hexagrams of the I Ching were the model for establishing a meta-language. And it is on this basis that actually Leibniz himself would invent a presentation of binary arithmetic that will soon become the basis for what has evolved till today into computer language. Somehow, maybe there will not be any computer language today without the rediscovery of the meaning of the structure, not the meaning, the structure of the I Ching by Bouvet and by Leibniz. So figurists evolved from this observation, I will say, of Chinese character and language as a code, towards a systematic search for correspondences between the Chinese classics and the Bible, through the identification of symbolic and historical figures. This is why one speaks of figurism, for speaking of this particular current of Jesuit theology in China. Actually, Bouvet and other figurists were soon hindered by the superior, but many of them had a kind of prophetic understanding of the work they were doing. So we see that the figurist endeavor that has been cut by history but remains alive in some respect through its rereading till today, illustrate the intricacy of the questions that China was raising for the Christian understanding of history, of other religion, and of morality and the human mind. The figurist movement also maybe showed the deadlock of a mode of reading the Bible that was too literal. I will say the figurists were too literal, both in reading the Bible and reading the Chinese classic. And the advances of the 17th century, pursued in the 19th century, were most of the historical shaping of the classics that relativizes the text as we are reading it today. But still, Bouvet was reading the I Ching as a key applicable to all sciences. That was, he said, the writing system used by scholars before the flood. We can, of course, smile today of that kind of formulation, but we can admire this kind of quest for the universality of the human mind that was behind it. And Bouvet and other figurists were actually very, very good scholars of Chinese classics. So China was providing materials for a new theological language and thinking, even if at that time such attempt could not reach maturation yet. So maybe someone who was knowing even more Chinese classics than Bouvet was Joseph de Prémart. There is a long manuscript left of him, which is called Remains of the Main Christian Dogma, taken from the ancient Chinese book, which reads a bit like a detective story. In all Chinese classics as canonized by the Chinese Empire, and Prémart knows the classics very, very well, he detects the figure of Christ. So he says all the Jing come back to the I Ching, as the streams go back to their source. It is necessary to reduce to a common principle all the doctrines that can be contained in the Jing. Whoever finds a way to bring all these books back to a coherent system of doctrines will have found their true meaning. At the same time, he says, the knowledge of the true doctrine of the Jing is entirely lost among the Chinese. So Prémart wants to read the Chinese classics better than the Chinese read it. So he quotes a number of Chinese authors who pondered about the symbolic and esoteric character of the Chinese classics. Prémart says, one can say with a very great probability that all the Jing relate to a holy and divine personage are their only object. His virtue, his merit, the benefaction he brings, his mystery, his holy law, his reign, his glory, even more his very works, are reported in their books in a way that is obscure for the Chinese, but very clear for us who know Jesus Christ. He then compares the blindness of Chinese commentators to that of the Jewish commentators. So you see the Chinese classics are like the Old Testament, and the Chinese are the Jews of their classics, who refuse to discern the true meaning of the scripture. But still, Chinese commentators are still very useful, he says, because they cling to the natural meaning of the text. They assert many good things. They can be of great help to criticize different authors. From their very error and contradiction, the truth sometimes can be drawn. Thus, poisons are used to compose excellent remedies. Chinese classics are Chinese commentaries are poisons, but if you mix them well, you make it a remedy for getting to the meaning of Chinese classics. You see, we are somehow in what I call the archaeology of today's Asian theology. And we can smile at it or even be indignant of it once in a while. But somehow it was needed to cross all those modes of reading in order to find a way to read together our classics as equal partners. And that was not an easy endeavor. Actually, today, contemporary Chinese scholars show special sensitivity to the fact that sinology, so all this knowledge about Chinese classic amassed by Jesuits, was somehow bound from the comparative reading of the classics and delivered by the Jesuits in dialogue and sometimes in conflict with the Chinese literature. The interpretation of the encounter between Confucianism and Christianity is a topic of particular interest, and more generally, the comparative studies of classic is generating a growing body of literature. So be it in Beida, in Fudan, in Zhejiang University, in other places. You've got many well-known professors who have published extensively on the subject I have just sketched, and an astounding number of Chinese students who do their master or doctoral thesis on one aspect of what I have just spoken about. Though this field is of much interest till today in China. So let us try to summarize some of the historical facts I have been evoking, as you can guess, evoking far too quickly till now. There were different strategies when reading the classics. On the missionary side, the first strategy turned towards the Chinese was to offer an interpretation of the Chinese classics grounded in the content of the Western classics that were introduced to their audience, so as to show that the current basket was confirming the first. So somehow you were first introducing science, and you were saying, if science is true, faith is true also. Okay? At the same time, there was a strategy from the same ones turned toward Europe, so as to justify their work in China. They were introducing the Chinese classics so as to mitigate the gap existing between them and the Western creed. And they were providing resources of natural theology for suggesting conciliation. They were saying, no, Chinese are just not pagans. They have a knowledge of God that justify the strategy we are using toward them in order to build up a Chinese Christianity. Okay, another way, completely different, which was the one of some of the successors of Ricci, the one opposed to him, was to go exactly the opposite way, to highlight the basic opposition to Christian beliefs and value with the Chinese. So one wanted to create new terms, new vocabulary, which is more or less what has been done in Japan, for instance, so as to ensure terminological, dogmatic, ritual integrity. Okay. So today when we read those documents, we think, hey, actually those Chinese people had an internal understanding of Chinese Christian spirituality much deeper than you say. But someone like Longobardo, an adversary of Ricci, the second superior of the mission, had a kind of dogmatic worldview that was making him more sensitive to what was blurred in terms of dogmatic definitions. So he wanted to invent a Christian vocabulary totally independent from the Chinese classics. And finally, there was a fourth strategy, the one I spoke most, the figurist, that was aiming at both the Chinese and Western audience, that was dreaming to unearth a meta-language that would reconcile the varieties of languages through which God has revealed his truth. That was the most ambitious one, but in the context of the time, it was failed to doom. So in any case, the first strategy, which is the most important historically, obliged missionaries to make the study of Chinese classics the basis of their study. Moreover, as missionaries were observing the reaction of their Chinese audience, they were shaping and reshaping their own understanding of the Chinese canon and of the extent their faith could accommodate the culture. Taken as a whole, these strategies have been influencing also Western sinology, theological and philosophical interpretation given to the diversity of world culture. So to some extent, the dialogue between West and East, creeds of the West and creeds of the East that has been developing from the mid-20th century on, has been rooted from those inchoative attempts started by Jesuit and Chinese literati in the 17th and 18th century. The failure of figurism, of course, forbade for some time to further attempts at comparative theology, theology grounded in dialogue, that first occurred. Comparative theology, so a theology based on a dialogue between the text, between the classic, is a new discipline. Doing comparative theology starts with recognizing one's courage within a given religious tradition, so as to investigate another tradition and explore the nexus of similarities and differences that link one tradition to another, before returning to one's tradition with new questions and insights. The commitment to a particular tradition is thus acknowledged, as well as the context from which a theologian develops her or his line of inquiry. So necessarily an attempt at doing comparative theology operates dialogically, moving from the original tradition to another one, with which it has developed a privilege, a transformative relationship. So let's try to even enlarge more some lessons from this travel from 16th, 17th, 18th attempts in China to comparative theology, to what is happening in Asia and for Asian theology today. We now are convinced that the locus of truth is set into history and cultures, a setting to which only dialogue gives access. In such a setting, dialogical exchange is no longer a mechanical process. It centers about establishing meaningful relationship between people who are mutually other to the other. Exchanges implies to experience the very act of listening as a transformating process that cannot be separating from the ones who which truth is which. I read truth as long as I am transformed. Exchanges take place often with reference to a canon, to scriptures, to classic, that define a culture setting into the world. This is where it is so important today to still keep all its central setting to the comparative reading of classics in the shaping of the dialogical endeavors that develops among culture. We are still immersed in our classics, even if we ignore it. It is better both to discover how much we depend on our classics and how much the other depend on it, and to mutually discover the classics of the others. At the same time, meeting with a variety of classics implies to meet with a diversity of styles. Style is basic. One often say that the style is the man. I am my style. You discover me through my style of speaking, interacting. Confucius, Chuang-Tzu, Jesus, the Indian sages, Shakyamuni, Socrates, Seneca, enter into dialogue with their disciple, their adversary, but also with the generations of readers who have been dealing with their testimonies in widely different fashion. From this perspective, we must understand dialogue as a regulatory idea, as a kind of principle that is governed by three principles. So I will spell out the principles through which we can meaningfully dialogue. First, the historical and cultural variety of dialogical styles forbids us to establish one of them as a norm, as a standard. For instance, we will not say Socratic dialogue is the quintessence of dialogue has to be. Second, dialogical styles developed in different contexts are led throughout history to meet and transform each other, which means I now know the way Confucius was dialoguing with his disciple, Jesus with the people he was meeting, and Socrates with his protagonist. And I am sensitive to this variety of styles, and somehow it forms in a mysterious, synthesis, the way I am going myself to engage into dialogue, giving, for instance, its place of reason, but not demoting dialogue to a simple logical exercise. The fact that these dialogical styles meet and evolve will modify the modalities of their encounter. The common habitation of oikumene, which means our common universe, of the universe which is us, which is ours, triggers the emergence of a dialogical meta-style. This is what I say. We're inventing a style of meeting, even, for instance, in international setting. It's in the United Nations. Slowly, there is a way of debating that is common to all that will be emerging through the confluence of all dialogical styles. Such process, when maintained and nurtured, goes against the specialization of languages that often threaten the academia. Each discipline has its language. Sociologists understand only sociologists. Physicians, of course, understand only physicians. Literary critics understand only literary critics. So within a university, actually, departments are unable to dialogue with other departments. That's a very common phenomenon. So the contrary process, the process of mixing up dialogical styles, calls for the continuous redefinition of the language games that enable all participants to deepen and to enrich communication. Though what I call the emergence of a dialogical meta-style is both a reality that we can state. We see how different people meeting with different language learn to foster a new dialogical style, but it is also an imperative, a way of struggling against the division of the work between communities, each with its own language that cannot communicate with the other languages. Though the dialogical reading of the classics explore the extent and limits of the global conversation, we said that already. Looking at the process through which the comparative study of classic, a kind of cross-cultural theology, has jointly originated, as we have done. We saw that theology, sinology, the knowledge of Chinese things, the knowledge of Chinese classics have been progressing together, leads us to consider anew whether our present research endeavors, the way we engage into them, are conducive or not of the dialogical building of a global community. Once again, what I said is relevant for speaking about Chinese theology, for instance, today. Let me quote something from Chloe Starr in a book that is called Chinese Theology, Text and Context, published in 2016. Chinese theology, like Chinese text reading, is essentially relational. This is not the virtuoso performance of a scholastic, not the work of one theologian, where the reader of students follows along the steps to their logical conclusion, but a more open process. This is this openness that I've tried to state till now, to underline, where the reader, conceived as a peer, is invited to make connection from within a shared intranet of allusion. The text is open-ended. a common heritage in the Chinese classics and a reading pattern that proceeds via a series of implicit association in the mind of the reader create a more participative and open-ended way of reading and of engaging with theology. Here is a conclusion at that point of Cloester. Just as Christianity was being transformed into Chinese forms by local adaptation and innovation in communities and patterns of prayer built upon a church or mission house, those are the concrete aspects of the building of Christian communities in China. So Chinese Christian theology, which is one expression of Asian theologies we are investigating in this course, though Chinese Christian theology underwent its own process of transformation into a local textual religion. So maybe let's stop at that for today. Next week or next time again, during the next lesson, we will be dealing with Indian theology. And I insist on the word Indian to contrast it with the word Chinese. We have taken our example till now from the Chinese context. I would like to oppose, but also maybe to find similarities, with another way, another style of theology, which is as Asian as the first one, which is a way of doing theology in India, in the present day context of India. And I think that comparing between China and India will help us to go one step further when trying to find some commonalities in the way Asian theology today deal with violence, with reconciliation, and with peace building.